What does a life built on 15 years of love and sacrifice look like when it's shattered in 15 seconds? For Eleanor Vance, it looked like a perfectly packed suitcase and the glint of car keys in her husband's hand. He told her he was leaving her for a woman half her age, a woman who offered him a future she no longer could. Eleanor was left with nothing but a quiet, empty house and the ghost of a future that had been stolen. But in the depths of her despair, a letter would arrive, an inheritance from a man she barely remembered that would change everything. This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about what happens when the woman everyone underestimated inherits a billion-dollar empire and is forced to become the queen she never knew she was. The silence in their suburban Connecticut home had become a living entity. It breathed in the spaces between clipped sentences and echoed in the hallways where laughter used to reside. Eleanor Vance, at 42, had become an expert in interpreting this silence. Tonight it was heavy, suffocating, carrying the bitter scent of an ending she'd refused to see coming. For 15 years, she had been the bedrock of Mark Stanton's life. She'd been the one who worked 2 jobs to put him through his MBA program, the one who proofread his reports until 3 a.m., and the one who networked tirelessly at bland corporate dinners, charming his superiors while he took the credit. She had willingly shrunk her own world, postponing her dreams of opening a small art gallery so that his could expand. His success, she'd told herself, was their success. Now, as a senior vice president at a rapidly growing tech firm, Sterling Finch Associates, he had the world at his feet. And he was about to use those feet to walk right out of her life. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to her, swirling a glass of Macallan 18. The expensive whiskey had been her anniversary gift to him 2 months prior. He hadn't even opened it until tonight. "I need to tell you something, Ellie," he said, his voice unusually flat, stripped of the easy charm that had once captivated her. Eleanor's hands stilled over the half-folded laundry on the sofa. "You've been quiet all week, Mark. Is everything okay at work?" It was her default setting to soothe, to manage, to fix his world. He turned, and the look on his face was one she'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but a cold, hard resolve. He looked like a stranger wearing her husband's face. "It's not about work. It's about us." The 3 words landed like stones in the quiet room. "Us," she whispered, her heart beginning a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. "There is no us anymore," he stated, taking a deliberate sip of his whiskey. "I'm leaving." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs in a sharp, painful rush. She sank onto the couch, the crisp scent of laundry detergent suddenly nauseating. Leaving. For a business trip. "You didn't tell me?" "No, Eleanor," he interrupted, his patience already worn thin. "I'm leaving you." He gestured toward the hallway where a sleek leather suitcase stood waiting by the door, a suitcase she hadn't noticed. "My things are packed." Her mind raced desperately, searching for a reason, a fight she'd forgotten, a slight she'd made. There was nothing. They hadn't truly connected in months, maybe years, but this was an amputation without warning. Why? The word was a pathetic squeak. "What did I do?" Mark let out a sigh, a sound of profound irritation, as if her question were an inconvenient piece of administrative work he had to get through. "You didn't do anything. That's the problem. We're stuck, Ellie. This house, this routine. It's a comfortable prison. I'm 45. I want more. I want to feel alive. And I make you feel dead," she asked, the words coated in a disbelief that was quickly curdling into horror. He finally had the decency to look away, focusing on the dying embers in the fireplace. "I've met someone. Of course." The cliché was so brutal, so common, it felt like a parody. But the pain was blindingly real. It radiated from her chest, a searing heat that made it hard to breathe. "Who?" "Her name is?" "Chloe Decker," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with an ease that suggested he'd practiced it, savored it. "She's different. She's vibrant. She sees the world as an adventure." Eleanor didn't need to ask. She knew. She's young. She's 26. He admitted a flicker of defiance in his eyes. And she believes in me. She sees the man I'm trying to become, not the man I've been. The insult was a dagger twisted with precision. Every sacrifice she'd ever made, every late night, every canceled plan with friends, every dollar she'd invested in him, it was all being reframed as a cage he was now bravely escaping. She had built this man piece by piece, and now he was walking away with a newer, shinier model. 15 years, Mark. She choked out tears, finally blurring his cold, handsome face. We built a life together. You don't just throw that away for a 26-year-old's sense of adventure. It's not just that, he said, his voice hardening again. Chloe's father is a partner at a venture capital firm. She understands my world. She can help me. With her connections, I can finally break free from Sterling Finch and start my own company. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. The confession was more devastating than the affair itself. It wasn't just about passion. It was a business transaction. He had weighed his options, calculated the return on investment, and she had been deemed a depreciating asset. He was liquidating their marriage for a chance at a more profitable merger. He walked over to the antique writing desk in the corner, a piece she had lovingly restored by hand. He placed a thick manila envelope on the polished wood. These are the divorce papers. My lawyer drew them up. I think you'll find the terms are adequate. The house is mortgaged to the hilt for my seed capital, so it'll have to be sold. But you'll get half of what's left. It's fair. Fair. The word was a mockery. He was taking their shared past, their future, and a young new partner, and leaving her with half the proceeds of a forced sale and a set of legal documents. Eleanor stood up, her legs trembling. She walked toward him, a storm of fury and grief raging inside her. For a moment she thought she might scream, might claw at his face, might shatter the expensive bottle of whiskey over his head. But when she spoke, her voice was eerily calm. "Get out," she said. Mark looked surprised, as if he had expected more tears, more pleading. "Ellie, let's be adults about this." I said, "Get out of my house," she repeated, her voice low and dangerous. The woman who had spent 15 years accommodating him was gone. In her place was someone he didn't recognize. "Take your suitcase and your ambition and your collateral and get out." He stared at her for a long moment, then shrugged a final dismissive gesture. He picked up his keys from the mantelpiece. "Fine. My lawyer will be in touch with yours." He walked out the door without a backward glance. The click of the lock echoed in the crushing silence. Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that was no longer hers. The laundry was still unfolded. The dinner she'd planned was still in the refrigerator. The future she had believed in was gone. She slowly sank to her knees, the sound of her own broken sobs, the only thing filling the vast empty space where a marriage used to be. The 6 months that followed were a blur of gray. Eleanor moved through life like a ghost, haunting the ruins of her own existence. The beautiful house was sold, its contents divided with the sterile precision of a legal document. Mark, true to his word, had been fair. After paying off the second mortgage he'd taken out for his new venture, her share was barely enough to secure a small one-bedroom apartment in a less fashionable part of town and cover her expenses for a few months. Her days were formless. She'd wake up late, the sunlight filtering through the cheap blinds of her new apartment, feeling like an accusation. She applied for jobs, curator positions, gallery assistant roles, but her resume had a 15-year gap labeled homemaker. In a competitive market, she was an antique. Rejection emails piled up, each one a small, sharp confirmation of her own obsolescence. Mark, meanwhile, was thriving. She'd see him accidentally on purpose articles in the local business journal about his new startup, Stanton Innovations, with a smiling photo of him and a radiant Chloe Decker by his side. They were the city's new power couple. He was living the life he'd claimed she'd held him back from, and the world was applauding him for it. Eleanor was at her absolute nadir one Tuesday afternoon, staring at an eviction notice she'd found taped to her door when the letter arrived. It was innocuous, tucked between a credit card offer and a utility bill. The envelope was thick, cream-colored cardstock with the name of a prestigious-sounding law firm embossed in the corner, Davies & Finch, LLP. She assumed it was a mistake, or worse, another bill collector who'd bought her debt. She tossed it onto her small kitchen counter where it lay unopened for 3 days. The phone calls started on the 4th day. A polite, firm voice identified himself as James Davies, a senior partner at the firm. He insisted it was a matter of utmost urgency that he speak with Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Fearing a lawsuit she couldn't possibly afford, Eleanor finally answered. "This is she," she said, her voice weak. "Mrs. Vance. Thank you for taking my call." The man said, his tone one of respectful gravity. "I have been trying to reach you regarding the estate of my late client, Mr. Arthur Pendleton. It is imperative that you come to our offices at your earliest convenience." The name struck a distant, dusty chord in her memory. Arthur Pendleton, her mother's uncle, her great-uncle, a man she had met only once at a family funeral when she was 7 years old. She remembered a tall, severe-looking man with piercing blue eyes who had given her a strange, intricate puzzle box instead of a doll. Her mother had spoken of him in hushed, intimidated tones, the family eccentric, a recluse who had built some sort of vast business empire from nothing and had long since severed ties with the rest of the family. My great-uncle, Eleanor asked, confused. "I haven't seen or spoken to him in over 30 years. I'm afraid there must be some mistake." "There is no mistake, Mrs. Vance," Mr. Davies replied patiently. "Could you be at our offices tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Driven by a morbid curiosity and a sense that she had nothing left to lose, Eleanor agreed. The next morning she put on her one good suit, now a little loose on her frame, and took the bus downtown. The offices of Davies & Finch occupied the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper, a world of polished marble hushed tones and panoramic city views. It was a world she and Mark had once aspired to. Now she felt like an intruder. James Davies was an older gentleman, perhaps in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a reassuringly calm demeanor that stood in stark contrast to the opulence of his surroundings. He led her into a large wood-paneled conference room overlooking the city. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Vance," he began, gesturing for her to sit. "I was Arthur Pendleton's attorney and his friend for over 40 years. He was a singular man. He did not believe in empty gestures or pleasantries. He valued substance above all else." Eleanor nodded, unsure of what to say. "I barely knew him. I can't imagine why he would have mentioned me to you." Mr. Davies slid a thick leather-bound document across the vast mahogany table. "He did more than mention you, Mrs. Vance. This is his last will and testament. It is a very straightforward document. He had no wife and no children. With the exception of a few small bequests to his staff, he has left his entire estate to you." Eleanor stared at him blankly. His estate, eh? A house, some savings. She was thinking perhaps of enough money to pay her rent for a year. That alone felt like winning the lottery. A small, wry smile touched Mr. Davies' lips. Arthur was not a man of small things. His house is a 40-acre estate in Greenwich. His savings are a portfolio of investments managed by some of the sharpest minds on Wall Street. But the bulk of his estate, the very heart of it, is his company. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. He has left you his sole controlling interest in Pendleton Industries. Eleanor's mind went blank. Pendleton Industries. She'd heard the name, of course. It was a behemoth, a global conglomerate with interests in technology, manufacturing, real estate, and logistics. It was a name spoken with reverence in the financial world. It was an empire. "That's impossible," she stammered, shaking her head. "There has to be a mistake. He didn't know me. Why would he leave it all to me?" "Arthur had his reasons," Mr. Davies said softly. "He followed your life from a distance more than you know. He believed, well, his reasons are his own, and he left them for you to discover. He gestured to a smaller sealed envelope on the table. He left a letter, the first of several to be given to you today. Eleanor reached out a trembling hand and took the envelope. Her name was written on the front in a strong, spiky, old-fashioned script. She looked from the letter to the will, to the kind-faced lawyer who was telling her something so ludicrous, so life-altering, that it felt like a dream. What is it all worth? She whispered the question, feeling both vulgar and necessary. Mr. Davies looked at her, his expression unreadable. The valuations are still being finalized, but the conservative estimate, Mrs. Vance, is in the range of $9 billion. The room began to spin. $9 billion. The number was so abstract it was meaningless. It was a galaxy away from the eviction notice taped to her apartment door. Just yesterday, her biggest problem was how she would afford groceries for the next week. Now she was the heir to an empire built by a man she didn't know for reasons she couldn't fathom. The shock was so profound it felt like a physical blow. The quiet, broken woman who had walked into this office was gone. In her place sat someone else, someone with a new, terrifying, and unimaginable identity. She wasn't just Eleanor Vance, the abandoned wife. She was Eleanor Vance, the billionaire heiress. And her world, which had ended so brutally 6 months ago, was about to begin again in the most spectacular way possible. News of Eleanor's inheritance didn't just spread, it detonated. Within 48 hours, the mystery heiress of Pendleton Industries was the lead story on every financial news network. Journalists dug into her past, painting a portrait of a quiet suburban housewife thrust into an unimaginable position of power. Her quiet, painful divorce was suddenly public fodder. Eleanor hid in her small apartment, the blinds drawn as the world outside roared. Mr. Davies had arranged for a private security detail, and a calm, broad-shouldered man named Robert now sat in a car outside her building, turning away a relentless stream of reporters. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from distant relatives she hadn't heard from in decades, all offering their syrupy, opportunistic congratulations. But there was only one call she was waiting for. It came on the third day. The caller ID simply read, Mark. She let it ring 4 times before answering, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Hello, Mark," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Ellie, my God, is it true?" He sounded breathless, a frantic edge to his usually smooth tone. "The news? They're saying you inherited Arthur Pendleton's entire fortune. It's a joke, right? Some kind of insane media hoax." "It's not a hoax, Mark," she replied, a strange sense of detachment settling over her. A choked, strangled sound came from his end of the line. It might have been a laugh or a sob. $9 billion. They're saying $9 billion. Ellie, that's impossible. You met the man once. Nevertheless, it's true. The silence that followed was thick with the sound of a man's entire worldview shattering. She could picture him perfectly pacing his sleek, minimalist office at Stanton Innovations, his mind reeling, his ego screaming in protest. He had discarded her. He had calculated her worth and found it to be negligible. And he had been wrong on a scale so cosmic it was almost comical. "Well, my God, congratulations!" He finally managed to say the words, sounding like they were being dragged from him under duress. This is incredible. For you." "Yes, it is," she said, refusing to give him an inch of emotional satisfaction. Meanwhile, across town in a chic, glass-walled apartment, Chloe Decker was having a very different reaction. "What do you mean it's true?" she shrieked, throwing a copy of the Wall Street Journal at Mark. Eleanor's face, a candid photo taken years ago at a charity event, stared up from the front page. "That frumpy, boring woman is a billionaire, while we're struggling to make payroll. We are not struggling to make payroll." Mark snapped, his face pale with stress. Stanton Innovations wasn't the overnight success he had promised. His seed money was burning faster than he'd anticipated, And the investors Chloe's father had introduced him to were proving skeptical. "She has to give you some of it," Chloe insisted, her pretty face twisted with avarice. "You were married for 15 years. You built a life together. You're entitled to half of that. It's marital property." "It's not marital property, Chloe, I checked," Mark growled, running a hand through his hair. "The inheritance came after the divorce was finalized. I'm not entitled to a single damn penny." The injustice of it was a physical sickness in his gut. He had traded in his wife for a better prospect only to discover he'd traded a lottery ticket for a handful of magic beans. "Then you have to get back with her," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Talk to her. Apologize. Tell her you made a terrible mistake. She was always a sentimental fool for you, Mark. You can win her back." The thought was both humiliating and tantalizing. The idea of crawling back to Eleanor admitting his colossal error in judgment was galling. But the thought of her $9 billion... It was a siren song he couldn't ignore. Back in her apartment, Eleanor hung up on Mark stammering and finally opened the letter from her great-uncle. The paper was thick, the ink a faded black. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has likely been turned upside down for you. I imagine you are asking yourself a simple question. Why you? I will not burden you with a long sentimental explanation. I was not a sentimental man, but I was an observer of character. I met you only once when you were a child. You were crying because your cousins had broken a toy. But you were not crying about the toy. You were crying because, as you told me, they broke the rules. Even then you had a rigid, unshakable sense of fairness and order. A rare quality. I have followed your life from afar. I watched you sacrifice your own ambitions for your husband's. A foolish, sentimental act, I thought at the time, but it was also an act of profound loyalty and investment. You are a builder, Eleanor. You invested everything you had into building that man up. He, it turns out, was a poor investment, a shoddy foundation. I am leaving you my life's work, Pendleton Industries. It is not a gift. It is a burden. It is a vast, complex machine, and many of its parts are operated by men who will see you as an intruder, a foolish woman who won the lottery. They will test you. They will try to wrest control from you. They will expect you to take the money and disappear. Do not. You have spent 15 years building a man. Now I am giving you the chance to build an empire. The choice is yours. Take the money, live a life of leisure, and the jackals on my board will carve up my legacy within a year. Or step into my shoes, learn the machine, run it, show them what a builder can truly do. Your first test awaits you at the first board meeting. They will propose a candidate for CEO, a man named Charles Sterling. He is competent, but he is a caretaker, not a visionary. He will manage the company's decline gracefully. Your first decision is what to do about him. Do not let them intimidate you, child. You have iron in your spine. You've just let it go unused for too long. Yours, Arthur Pendleton. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. A strange sense of calm washed over her. The letter was a posthumous vote of confidence from a man who barely knew her, yet seemed to see her more clearly than anyone ever had. You are a builder. The words resonated deep within her. He was right. She had built a life, a home, a man. And when that was all torn down, she had crumbled. But Arthur wasn't asking her to be the person she had been. He was challenging her to become someone new. He wasn't just giving her his money, he was giving her a purpose, a new foundation to build upon. She picked up the phone and called Mr. Davies. "Please schedule the board meeting for next Monday," she said, her voice clear and firm. "And cancel the security detail. I'll be moving into my great-uncle's estate tomorrow. It's time I started acting like I belong there." The Pendleton estate in Greenwich was not a house. It was a kingdom. A long winding driveway cut through acres of ancient woods before opening onto a sprawling stone mansion that overlooked the Long Island Sound. It was intimidatingly grand, a monument to a life lived on a scale Eleanor could barely comprehend. Her first week was a whirlwind of introductions to household staff, meetings with wealth managers, and fittings with stylists who replaced her modest wardrobe with racks of tailored suits, silk blouses, and elegant dresses. It felt like putting on a costume, but with each passing day the role of Eleanor Vance heiress began to feel less like an act. The true test, however, was the first board meeting. It was held in a cavernous room at the Pendleton Industries headquarters in Manhattan. A dozen men, all older, all dressed in immaculate bespoke suits, were seated around a vast polished obsidian table. The air was thick with skepticism and cologne. At the head of the table sat Charles Sterling, the man Arthur's letter had warned her about. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and an air of patrician authority. He was the chairman of the board, and it was clear he considered himself the de facto ruler of this empire. "Ms. Vance," he began, his tone dripping with condescending courtesy. "On behalf of the board, allow me to express our deepest condolences on the passing of your great uncle. Arthur was a Titan. His shoes will be impossible to fill." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Especially for you. We understand this must be an overwhelming time for you." Sterling continued. "Therefore, to ensure the stability of the company, the board has moved to unanimously nominate a new CEO. I have graciously agreed to step into the role to guide Pendleton Industries through this transition." He smiled, a placid, dismissive smile that said the matter was already settled. The other board members murmured their assent. They were looking at her, but they weren't seeing her. They were seeing a problem to be managed, a figurehead to be placated with dividends while they ran the show. Eleanor felt a tremor of her old self, the timid, accommodating woman who would have nodded, signed the papers, and gratefully accepted her comfortable exile. But then she thought of Arthur's letter. "You have iron in your spine." She took a slow, deliberate breath. "Thank you for your condolences, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the silent room. "And thank you for your gracious offer. However, I cannot accept it at this time." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Charles Sterling's smile tightened. "I beg your pardon, Ms. Vance, with all due respect. This company is a multi-billion-dollar global entity. It requires an experienced hand at the helm." "I agree," Eleanor said smoothly. "Which is why I find it puzzling that the board would nominate a CEO before the new owner has even had a chance to review the company's current state. It seems premature." She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member one by one. "I will not be a passive owner, gentlemen. For the next 90 days, the position of CEO will remain vacant. I will be taking that time to personally conduct a full review of every division of this company. I will be meeting with every department head. I will be reading every financial report. And at the end of those 90 days, I will decide who is best suited to lead my company into the future." She let her gaze settle back on Sterling. "That may be you, Mr. Sterling. It may not be. Until then, you and this board will report directly to me." The silence that followed was absolute electric. She had thrown a grenade onto their perfectly polished table. Sterling's face was a mask of fury, his patrician composure shattered. He had expected a mouse. He had found a lioness. "You are making a grave mistake," he said, his voice a low growl. "The only mistake, Mr. Sterling," Eleanor replied, rising from her chair, "would be to underestimate me. My great-uncle did not make that mistake. I suggest you don't either." She turned and walked out of the room. Her back straight, her head held high, leaving a stunned and furious board of directors in her wake. She didn't know if she had just won their respect or declared a war she couldn't win. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt a thrilling, terrifying surge of power. She wasn't just wearing the costume anymore. She was starting to become the person Arthur Pendleton had believed her to be. The news of her boardroom coup reached Mark within the hour. A contact on the Pendleton board, a man he had once golfed with, called him in a panic. "Your ex-wife is a dragon, Stanton," the man sputtered. "She just walked in here and castrated Sterling in front of the entire board. She's taking over. She's insane." Mark hung up the phone, a cold dread mixing with a bitter, burning envy. The sentimental fool he thought he could win back was gone. In her place was a formidable, ruthless stranger. A queen. And he, Mark Stanton, the brilliant entrepreneur, was beginning to realize a terrifying truth. His biggest asset wasn't the venture capital his new girlfriend's father could provide. His biggest asset was the woman he had thrown away, and now she was about to become his most powerful and unpredictable rival. The 90 days of Eleanor's review were a baptism by fire. She worked 18-hour days fueled by coffee and a ferocious determination to prove her great-uncle right. She devoured financial reports, strategic plans, and personnel files. She walked the floors of Pendleton manufacturing plants, donned a hard hat at their construction sites, and sat in on the pitch meetings of their tech incubators. She wasn't just learning the business. She was absorbing it, making Arthur's empire her own piece, by painstaking piece. The board under Charles Sterling's resentful leadership tried to obstruct her at every turn. They buried her in jargon-filled reports, scheduled meetings on impossibly short notice, and subtly encouraged department heads to be uncooperative. But they underestimated her resolve. The same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to managing Mark's career, she now applied to dissecting a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. And she was a very fast learner. It was during her review of the Pendleton Capital Division, the company's venture capital arm, that she saw it. A funding proposal from a plucky startup called Stanton Innovations, Mark's company. Her blood ran cold. He was coming to her company for money. The irony was so thick she could have choked on it. He had left her in part for better financial connections, and now he was unknowingly kneeling at her altar begging for an investment. The proposal was desperate. Stanton Innovations was burning through its initial seed money at an alarming rate. They had a promising prototype for a new logistics software, but they were months behind schedule and hemorrhaging cash. Without a significant Series A funding round, they would be insolvent within 6 months. Her first instinct was a savage, satisfying desire for revenge. She could crush him. A single word from her no, and his dream, the very dream for which he had destroyed their marriage, would die. She could leak the news of his impending failure to the press. She could ruin him utterly. The thought was a dark, intoxicating poison. That night she found the second letter Arthur had left for her tucked away in his library, with a note for Mr. Davies to give it to her after her first month. Eleanor. By now you have likely encountered the jackals. You have felt their teeth. I trust you have shown them your own. But a leader must be more than a fighter. A fighter can win a battle, but it takes a builder to win a war. Pendleton Industries did not become what it is by destroying its rivals. It grew by absorbing them, by identifying value where others saw none, and by turning weakness into strength. You will soon be faced with a choice to destroy something or to build from its ruins. Remember what you are. Be a builder, not a wrecker. Yours, Arthur. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time, the fire crackling in the massive stone hearth. Be a builder, not a wrecker. Arthur's words cut through her rage, offering a different path. Revenge was easy. It was an emotional spasm. Building was hard. It required vision, strategy, and a cold, clear head. The next morning she called the head of Pendleton Capital. I want to be in the final pitch meeting for the Stanton Innovations proposal, she said. But I am to be introduced only as a senior analyst from the new owner's office. No one is to know my name. Is that understood? The day of the pitch arrived. Eleanor sat at the far end of a long conference table, deliberately out of the main line of sight. She was dressed in a simple, severe gray suit, her hair pulled back, a pair of glasses perched on her nose. She was invisible. Mark Stanton walked in, flanked by Chloe Decker. He was a portrait of manufactured confidence, his suit sharp, his smile practiced. Chloe, dressed in a vibrant red dress that was wholly inappropriate for a venture capital pitch, looked around the room with an air of entitled boredom. Mark launched into his presentation. He was slick, charismatic, and passionate. He spoke of disruption, synergy, and market penetration. But Eleanor, armed with weeks of intensive study, could see the holes. His financial projections were wildly optimistic. His market analysis was superficial. His understanding of the supply chain challenges was amateurish. He was selling a dream, not a business. When he finished, the head of Pendleton Capital, a shrewd man named Marcus Thorne, began the grilling. "Mr. Stanton, your burn rate is unsustainable. How do you plan to achieve profitability when your customer acquisition cost is 3 times the industry average?" Mark faltered, offering a vague answer about economies of scale. Another executive pressed him on his technical architecture. He deflected. It was painfully clear he was out of his depth. Finally, Marcus Thorne turned to the end of the table. "Our senior analyst has a final question." All eyes turned to Eleanor. She took off her glasses, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Mark's eyes followed the others. He squinted, a flicker of confusion on his face. And then his eyes widened in horrified recognition. His confident posture collapsed as if his strings had been cut. The color drained from his face. "Ellie." He breathed the name, a dead sound in the sterile room. Chloe's head snapped toward her. Her perfectly made-up face contorted into a mask of disbelief and fury. "You." Eleanor ignored them both, her gaze fixed on Mark. Her voice was cold, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Mr. Stanton, your presentation was compelling. However, you failed to mention that your lead engineer quit 2 weeks ago, that your primary supplier has threatened to terminate your contract over unpaid invoices, and that your prototype failed its last 3 stress tests. You're not seeking an investment. You're seeking a bailout for a sinking ship." Every fact she stated was a perfectly aimed torpedo, blowing his flimsy presentation to pieces. The other executives stared stunned as she methodically, clinically dismantled his entire company in under 60 seconds. Mark stood frozen, speechless, exposed as a fraud in front of the very people he was trying to impress. The suave, confident CEO was gone. In his place was a terrified, humiliated man. Eleanor stood up, her composure absolute. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Stanton. We will be in touch." She walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of her ex-husband's dream. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't cried. She had simply wielded the truth like a weapon, and it had been more devastating than any emotional outburst could ever be. She hadn't been a wrecker, she had been a builder, and the first thing she had to do was clear away the shoddy foundation. Mark and Chloe stumbled out of the Pendleton Industries building in a daze. The humiliation was a physical coating on Mark's skin. He had been stripped bare professionally and personally by the woman he had dismissed as a simple homemaker. "What was that?" Chloe hissed, her voice trembling with fury as they hit the sidewalk. "How did she know all that? Have you been talking to her?" "Of course I haven't been talking to her!" Mark yelled back, his composure finally cracking. Cars honked as they argued on the busy street corner. "She's the owner, Chloe. She owns the whole damn company. She has access to everything. This is your fault." Chloe accused, her eyes wild. "You told me she was nobody. You told me you were trading up. You traded your billionaire wife for me, and I've got nothing to show for it but a maxed-out credit card and an apartment that's about to be repossessed." The raw transactional nature of their relationship was finally laid bare. "I thought your father was going to help." Mark shot back, his voice thick with desperation. "My father helps winners. Mark, not failures who get humiliated by their ex-wives." She looked at him with pure, undisguised contempt. "You're not the man I thought you were. You're weak. And I'm done." She hailed a cab, her red dress a flash of fury. "Don't call me," she spat before climbing in and slamming the door. The taxi pulled into traffic, and just like that, the vibrant, adventurous future Mark had left his wife for vanished. He was alone on a crowded street, his company in flames, his lover gone, his entire life a smoldering ruin. 2 days later, a formal offer letter from Pendleton Capital arrived at his office. Mark's hands trembled as he opened it. He was expecting a final brutal rejection. But what he read was far more cruel and far more brilliant. Pendleton Capital was offering to acquire Stanton Innovations. They weren't investing. They were buying the entire company, assets and intellectual property included. The price they offered was just enough to cover his outstanding debts and pay his creditors, leaving nothing for him or his initial investors. The offer saved the jobs of his employees and prevented him from having to declare bankruptcy, preserving his name from that final disgrace. But the real sting was in the conditions. The acquisition was contingent on him staying on for a 1-year transitional period. His new title would be Junior Project Manager. His new boss, reporting directly to the board, would be a rising star in the Pendleton Tech division. His salary was a fraction of his old one, and as the new owner of the company, all major decisions would ultimately need to be approved by Eleanor Vance. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. She hadn't destroyed him. She had owned him. She had taken his dream, his company, his very identity as a CEO, and turned him into her lowest-ranking employee. To refuse the deal meant certain financial ruin and a slew of lawsuits from his investors. To accept meant a year of profound daily humiliation, working as a cog in the machine of the woman he had abandoned. He was trapped. With a shaking hand he signed the papers. It was an act of complete and utter surrender. Eleanor reviewed the signed contract in her vast, sunlit office overlooking the city. There was no triumph in her heart, only a quiet, resolute finality. This wasn't about Mark anymore. This was about the assets. Stanton Innovations, for all its mismanagement, had a core of good engineers and the kernel of a valuable software idea. Under Pendleton's management, it could be turned into something profitable. It was a salvage operation. She was being a builder. She buzzed her assistant. "Please schedule my 90-day review with the board for tomorrow morning," she said. "And please have the corporate counsel draft a termination agreement for Mr. Charles Sterling. His services will no longer be required." The following day, she walked into the boardroom not as a curious heiress, but as its undisputed master. She presented a detailed 90-page strategic plan for the company, outlining her vision for the next 5 years. She identified underperforming divisions to be sold, promising new markets to be explored, and innovative technologies to be acquired, starting with Stanton Innovations. Her command of the material was absolute. The board, which had once looked at her with such disdain, was now staring in awe. She concluded her presentation by announcing the formation of a new executive search committee to find a world-class CEO who would execute her vision. Charles Sterling sat ashen-faced as his reign came to an unceremonious end. He had underestimated the quiet woman, and it had cost him his career. As Eleanor left the meeting, a sea of respectful faces parting before her, she felt the last vestiges of her old life fall away. She was no longer Mark's ex-wife or Arthur's heir. She was the architect of her own future, the head of a global empire, a woman forged in betrayal and remade in fire and finance. The iron in her spine was no longer just present. It was the core of her entire being. 3 years passed. Under Eleanor's leadership, Pendleton Industries didn't just stabilize, it soared. She proved to have an almost preternatural instinct for business, a blend of Arthur's visionary boldness and her own meticulous, compassionate pragmatism. She invested heavily in sustainable technologies, streamlined the company's bloated bureaucracy, and implemented generous employee wellness programs that attracted the best talent in the world. The company's stock price tripled. The financial press, which had once called her the mystery heiress, now referred to her as the Vance Virtuoso, or the Pendleton Queen. The woman herself was transformed. The grief and uncertainty that had haunted her features were gone, replaced by a calm, unshakable confidence. She moved with purpose, spoke with authority, and commanded the respect of everyone from world leaders to the janitorial staff in her building. She had finally opened her art gallery, a non-profit space dedicated to showcasing emerging artists from underprivileged backgrounds, funded by a small fraction of her personal wealth. She had found a way to merge the woman she had been with the woman she had become. Tonight she was hosting a major philanthropic gala at the New York Public Library, announcing the formation of the Pendleton Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar charity dedicated to global education and technological literacy. Dressed in an elegant dark blue gown, she moved through the glittering crowd, a beacon of grace and power. Across the room, a man in an ill-fitting waiter's uniform was refilling champagne flutes. His shoulders were stooped, his face puffy, his eyes hollow. It was Mark Stanton. After his one-year contract of humiliation at Pendleton Industries had ended, he had been unceremoniously let go. No other tech company would touch him. His name was tainted by his spectacular failure and the widely whispered story of his downfall. He had bounced from one low-paying sales job to another, his arrogance eroded by the harsh reality of his new station. He now worked for a high-end catering company, serving drinks to the very people he had once considered his peers. He saw her from across the vast vaulted room. She was luminous, surrounded by senators, artists, and titans of industry. She was laughing, and the sound was rich and genuine. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years. An agonizing wave of regret so powerful it was nauseating washed over him. He saw not just the money he had lost, but the woman, the partner, the builder, the extraordinary person he had been too blind and too stupid to appreciate. On a desperate, foolish impulse, he set down his tray and began to make his way through the crowd toward her. He had to speak to her, to apologize, to explain. He didn't know what he wanted, forgiveness perhaps, or just to see if a flicker of the old Ellie still existed behind those powerful, confident eyes. He finally reached the edge of her circle just as a reporter was asking her a question. "Ms. Vance, you've achieved so much in such a short time. What would you say is the secret to your success?" Eleanor smiled, a thoughtful, private sort of smile. "A few years ago, someone I respected very much told me I was a builder. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I've come to realize that we all have a choice. We can spend our lives demolishing things, relationships, opportunities, other people. Or we can choose to build. Building is harder. It takes patience and vision. But in the end, it's the only thing that truly lasts." Her eyes swept the crowd as she spoke, and for a fleeting second they met Mark's. There was no anger in her gaze, no hatred, no triumph. There was nothing at all. It was the indifferent glance one might give a stranger a piece of furniture, a ghost. In that single empty moment, Mark understood the final devastating truth: she hadn't forgotten him. She had simply erased him. He no longer mattered enough to be hated. Her security chief, Robert, the same man who had once guarded her small apartment, stepped subtly between them, his presence an impassable wall. Mark faltered, then retreated, melting back into the shadows of the service staff. Later that night, back in the quiet solitude of her great-uncle's library, Eleanor opened a small locked drawer in his desk. Inside was the final letter from Arthur, with instructions that it only be opened when she felt she no longer needed his advice. "My dearest Eleanor," it read, "if you are reading this, it means you have become the woman I always knew you were. I have a final confession to make. The reason I chose you was not because of your sense of fairness or because you were a builder. Those things were true, but they were secondary. The real reason is this. 40 years ago, I was in love. A brilliant, wonderful woman. I was building my company and I was obsessed. I was arrogant. I believed she was holding me back from my destiny. I left her. It was the single greatest regret of a long and profitable life. I spent the next 4 decades building an empire, but I was alone in my castle. When I saw your husband make the same foolish, arrogant mistake that I did, I saw a chance. Not to correct my own past, but to give you the future that the woman I loved never had. I was not giving you a gift, Eleanor. I was righting a cosmic wrong 1 generation removed. The empire was never the point. It was just the tool. The point was you. The point was to give a good woman, a builder, the chance to build a world of her own. Live well in it. Yours." Arthur, tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, not of sadness, but of a profound, quiet gratitude. She looked out the window at the moonlit sound, at the vast, peaceful kingdom she now commanded. It was not a castle built on revenge or bitterness. It was an empire built on a second chance, a legacy of a long-lost love, and the quiet strength of a woman who had lost everything only to find herself. She was home. Eleanor's story is a powerful reminder that our worth is never defined by who leaves us, but by what we choose to build in their absence. She was discarded, underestimated, and left with nothing, but she transformed her pain into power. She didn't just inherit an empire, she earned the right to lead it by rediscovering the strength that was in her all along. Her journey teaches us that the end of one chapter is often the unexpected beginning of a much greater one, and that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so magnificent that the past becomes an insignificant shadow. If this story of resilience and empowerment moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories. What did you think of Eleanor's final choice? Let us know in the comments below.